About 4 years ago, I was at an auction, and I bought something that I thought was very, very unusual. And it was this pipe. And it's a stone pipe carved out of a solid piece of stone by Indians in the Stone Age. This goes back to about 2,000 years ago to around the year 100 in central Ohio. And as I looked at it, I said, this is amazing because it's got this little tiny hole in it. And I could not understand, after having been in manufacturing for 40 years, how anyone in the Stone Age could drill that tiny little perfectly straight hole through a solid piece of stone. And the smallest Indian drill I could find that was made out of stone was about this size. And obviously you could not drill that hole with this. You had to have something much smaller, tougher, and stronger. So I ended up reading a stack of books on Indians. A stack of books must have been that high. It took me a couple of 3 years. And no one talked about how they actually drilled the hole. They talked about Indian drills. They were made out of a bow with a string, and they would put the drill in there and move the thing back and forth. So I understood how their drill worked. But what was the drill bit that made that hole? And it was just mystifying, and no one dealt with it. The thousands of archaeologists and historians who studied Indians, nobody focused on that hole and how they got it perfectly round through a solid piece of stone. So as I was reading along, I started to get a real appreciation for what the Stone Age was. And in this part of the world, in Pennsylvania, the oldest Indian settlement goes back to 12,000 BC. It's called the Meadowcroft Settlement, and it's just south, about 20 miles south of Pittsburgh. And I realized for 14,000 years, Indians had been developing a society that not only could drill these holes to make these pipes, but why did they make those pipes? As every Indian tribe had decisions to make. They had to say, are we going to attack the Eries? Or are we going to plant squash or beans with our corn? I mean, every tribe had these decisions to make. And how they would make it is every brave would sit around the fire, and each brave would put his tobacco in his pipe, and each brave would say, I think we should plant squash. And the next one would say, I think we should plant beans. And as they went around the table, after each Indian gave his opinion, he would and blow a puff of smoke into the air. And as the puffs of smoke became one cloud, so the decisions of all of those Indian braves became the tribe's decision. So that's how these Indian pipes came about. They were very, very important. And you can imagine how long it took an Indian to take a piece of stone like that and cut it out perfectly round and drill that big hole. You could tell they drilled a big hole and then drill this little tiny hole. And the stone is fragile. The stone is delicate. The slightest imperfection in the stone is going to result in a cracked and broken thing. Weeks of work could be lost. So these guys were craftsmen. And I realized that every Indian tribe was a manufacturing center. They made things out of stone. They made things out of clay, like this. That's a hard thing to make out of clay and get it fired, have the little holes in it and do all this. It doesn't fit on a potter's wheel. They made that by hand. And I said, my God, these people were incredibly skilled. And I realized that every Indian village had a clay factory. And every Indian village had a stone factory. And every Indian village had a wood factory where they made their paddles for their canoes. And the wood factory could also make the supports for the canoes and maybe put the canoes together. And then they had a leather factory where they would scrape the skins of the things. And I realized the Indians had a sense of status. A rich Indian woman would scrape her hide with a handmade polished piece of stone. Now, can you imagine taking a rock and carving it into that and then polishing it? And when the women got together in their leather factory, the richest woman pulled out a stone scraper. Whoa, and all the other, I wish we had one of those. But that's what drove them, was this technology and this appeal to vanity, status, and efficiency. The stone one wouldn't break or wear out like a clamshell scraper would. This was a good thing to have. This is one of the most important Indian tools that I've ever seen. It is made out of a very hard baked clay from a southern tribe, possibly Mexico, Central America. But if you look at it, it is curved. Now, what that means is that they had standardized manufacturing for their clay pots. The clay pots had to have a diameter of 20-some inches for that to go into and for that to work. So every pot had to be cranked out by hand. They did not have potter's wheels, or at least most of them didn't. So they had to do by hand. They could make a part that was so exact that that curve would fit and put that embossed design in the wet clay. So you think about, my God, these people were not only intelligent, they were organized. They could get the clay, they could make the pot, the pots could be the exact size, and before it got hard, cracked, or broken, they could stamp it so that this nice design would go all the way around the pot. And that became an important article of trade. This then would be like putting buttons on a coat. You know, wow, what an invention that was. Well, suddenly this sort of invention is what let one Indian tribe turn their factories into more profitable production centers. So Indians were very, very inventive people. This started out as a jade rock about as big as a grapefruit. And Indian craftsmen were able to take it and cut a cylinder that would reach literally from nose to nose. And then they could drill out the center with another perfectly round hole. And then they had to sit down and carve 4 faces in that hole, in that pot. And this was a lot of work. This was, again, this is probably Aztec, and it is the new Stone Age. This is like the high point of their development. This started out as a rock, a flat rock, came in layers. They would split it in parts, but they didn't throw anything away. They would take this part of the rock and they would make something smaller out of it, maybe 4 or 5 things. So when the Indians got done with this rock, there were pipes, there were all kinds of amulets, decorations, smaller pipes, and maybe a tiny handful of waste. They made use of every last gram of material that they could make something out of. And then they had to polish it. They had to drill it from the top down, and they had to drill it from the bottom in. And then they had to take a piece of wood that made the pipe stem. Some of them were as long as 27 inches. They could drill a hole that size through 27 inches of wood that could stay in there. And they had to be careful it didn't fall off and break. I mean, this might have been a year or 2 years' work for an Indian brave or chief to have a pipe like that. And the last thing he wanted to do was have it broken. So some Indians had big pipes, and other Indian tribes said, we're not going to take any risk with that. We're just going to have small pipes that we're not going to drop and break. So there were different ways to solve the problems that they had to face. And the most effective Indian manufacturers were the ones who were able to take over the surrounding tribes. You know, their stones worked better, their bows worked better, their arrows worked better. Everything they did was focused on manufacturing skills. And the more I got into it, the more incredible it became. And I realized it wasn't just a sense of there were just manufacturers, there were also transport people. That's a piece of obsidian that ended up in Ohio, and it came from Idaho. Now, how did a piece of obsidian end up in Ohio from Idaho? Obviously, it was carried on somebody's back or on somebody's canoe or whatever for over 1,000 miles. And I realized, look what they did. When you look at that thing closely, you see how beautifully that thing is chipped. It's not cracked. It's not broken. The slightest mistake would ruin something that had taken a man 6 months or a year to carry here from Idaho. And then I saw this. Now, this old one is Old Stone Age. This is New Stone Age. This is a piece of obsidian, same rock, that is polished so well that the Aztecs used them for mirrors. They were absolutely incredible. And again, as a manufacturer, I knew how hard it was to polish things. You have to have a dozen grades of fineness in the polishing compounds, and they could take this piece of stone and turn it into this in the new Stone Age. It was absolutely incredible. And the more I studied the Indians, the more impressed I became with them. And frankly, the more disgusted I became with my own ancestors for wiping them out. Now, this was the Stone Age, and it went on for 14,000 years in western Pennsylvania. And all of a sudden, it came to an end. And what destroyed it? This is the interesting. The Episcopalians. This is a bronze worker in an Episcopalian factory. The bronze worker in the Episcopalian factory could fill that with melted bronze and pour it into a mold with 100 cavities. And in an hour, he could make 100 or 200 of what it would take an Indian maybe a couple of months to make. And suddenly, the Episcopalians had a peace pipe. And it was this, made out of brass in huge quantities. Polished, bright, shiny, and it wouldn't break if you dropped it. Pretty soon, every single Indian said, I got to get me an Episcopalian peace pipe. And they'd put the little wooden stone in it, and that was it. Well, the other end of the Episcopalian peace pipe was a tomahawk. This was no longer a peace pipe. This was an Episcopalian war pipe. And what they would do is they would give a free brass tomahawk to any Indian who brought a scalp from another Indian. Well, lots of Indians died. These young men could get drunked up and go on the rampage, and all of a sudden, hey, you owe me 50 tomahawks, and then go out and sell them for more booze, because they had a real problem with alcohol, and they just could not withstand its effects. So this is kind of how every village and every Indian city and every Indian factory from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific Ocean was put out of business. The Episcopalian bronze workers. And the bronze became a weapon of war that destroyed every single Indian economy that it met.